everyone. Welcome everyone. We're excited to be here today. This is the Zero Net Carbon Design Series. We've been happy to be working with 3C Ren on offering a whole range of building performance training, energy code training, and when California licensure started a new requirement as of this year to have 5 units of continuing education on zero net carbon design. We proposed and they enthusiastically supported that we develop this series to fulfill those requirements. We've offered it in person for the AIA San Luis Obispo and AIA Santa Barbara. If you were in person at those classes, this is the same material. You're welcome to sit in again, but if you think that this is something different, it is not. So it will be recorded happily. So you'll be able to reference it as you need to, and you'll also get PDF of the slides at the end. So that helps with your note taking as we go along. So this series is made up of 5 classes, about once a month. You do need to register for each one, but they're standalone. So you can get AIA continuing education units, health, safety, welfare for each of them. And it serves as that architecture licensure 5 units of continuing education. The plan is that we're assuming most people will attend all 5, and you'll get a certificate. We'll check your attendance, and you'll get a certificate at the end to show kind of the evidence for the architecture license, for the California license. The AIA continuing education, those will go through, but if you need a certificate before the very end, or if you're only doing some of them, please write to Itzel. And again, her email will be available to you all. So.
Andy, I think we had some folks who couldn't attend like every session, so then they were going to try and pick them up on this. So in those special cases, yeah, write to Itzel so that you can mix and match your classes.
Totally. Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that. So the series, as we have mapped it out, is that this first session, we're really talking about zero net carbon, kind of laying the groundwork. Jennifer is going to be your lead presenter on this one. And the second one, which is really about operational carbon, in contrast to embodied carbon, so energy efficiency, renewable energy, and those types of things. The third session is about the energy-water nexus and strategies for conserving water and understanding how that impacts carbon. And then moving into embodied carbon is the focus of session 4. It's pretty heavy duty, a lot about how to do that analysis. So, and it's newer, right? It's a little bit more leading edge for that. And then the 5th one is really looking at what's the bigger picture? What is regenerative design? How is that tying into the carbon story? So those are the learning objectives. And then today we're going to jump into targeting zero net carbon design as the overview. And with that, I turn it over to Jennifer.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Okay, I just want to say that if I see anyone drop off, and because you've been in the class before, I know you, I am not offended. Okay. I recognize a few names and I'm like, oh, they were in the class already. So just so you know. So to begin, just to give you an idea of where California is and the fact that, California has been on this path of energy efficiency and updating the energy code as part of the building code that we as architects and builders have to work with all the time. And so California has been on this path for 50 years. And just as a reminder, in the 1970s, we had a lot of environmental issues come up, and also what we call the energy crisis. And then our Title 24, Part 6, we think of the Energy Code, that began in 1978. And then in 2008, the California Energy Commission, also known as CEC, came up with an energy efficiency strategic plan. And then a lot of you will remember that in 2020, so the 2019 code, there was a PV requirement, so photovoltaic solar energy requirement for residential construction. And now we're moving into implementing some of the policies that were passed for 2030, where we have a huge reduction in greenhouse gases and increasing our renewable energy generation. And then the big goal 2045 is that we would be moving into 100% carbon-free electric generation. And that's kind of the big picture path that we're on. And what I wanted to share with you all, kind of as we work through this presentation, to really get a better understanding of where California was and the energy code, but where we're going in terms of carbon and what that means in terms of energy efficiency up to carbon. And I see this as these big buckets of, or categories, and we call them steps in this case, of where kind of California started and where we're headed. And we've kind of used these big categories as a way to organize the information, but also give you maybe a structure for a way to think about this process, this path that California has been on for 50 years. And so this first step, this first bucket, we're calling step A. That's really when the first energy code came into being. And the idea was that we saw, and I say we, the royal we, scientists, policymakers in California, building scientists, architects, saw that energy was a big deal for buildings and driving the need for more power plants to be built. Step B, this big bucket, is then what did California really do? They were able to avoid building new power plants. So that was huge. And then the next big bucket, step C, is we began to introduce and implement renewable energy resources to kind of counteract all the energy we still needed while avoiding power plants, while continuing to have more energy efficient buildings. And then step D, really, we're like in the midst of step C, D, E all together, but step D really is about, okay, now we need to look at our electric generation and the energy grid itself and make it more stable, make it resilient, and allow for storage so that we can avoid the need for using fossil fuel plants when the sun doesn't shine or the wind isn't blowing. Okay. And then step E is really looking at the embodied carbon of all the materials and all the energy and all the pollution associated with it for making those materials that we use in our construction process. So as we bring the energy use down, the next big thing to look at is, well, what about all the energy that went into getting those materials? And really, I see it like step E, that embodied carbon piece, like Andy said, is new for a lot of us. But this is like, we're at that embodied carbon frontier as architects, like many of us were back in step A when California first started to introduce and implement an energy efficiency part of the code, the building code. And now we're kind of full circle, but now we're talking embodied carbon. All the meanwhile, still doing step A, B, C, and D throughout the process. Okay, so that kind of sets up the big picture of where we're going with this presentation and where we're going with our whole 5-part series. So California is on this roadmap to zero net carbon, and kind of give you an idea of what that means for California is once all these plans are implemented, this is going to cut our air pollution by 71%. It's planned to cut all our greenhouse gas emissions attributed to this part of our construction industry by 85%. Going to drop our natural gas consumption by 94%. That's huge. Create 4 million new jobs and save Californians 200 billion in healthcare costs due to all the pollution associated with creating all the energy that we need. And as part of this whole presentation, this 5-part series, we're architects. So we definitely are having a building-centric approach to all of this. And we, kind of see a building as being in the middle, makes sense. The UN and their global status report also sees it that way. So I lifted this graphic from their report to kind of illustrate the concepts and how we're going through a lot of this. And so we've got, basically building design begins by addressing the operational energy efficiency and then adding various types of green energy sources. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the embodied energy and the carbon associated with all building materials and the production of that energy. So this is also a great resource if, and you're going to get a copy of the slides so that you'll be able to track down these resources as you want. And I recommend it if you're interested in this. So step A, energy code and energy reduction. Okay, this next section is going to be a quick history, just a couple of slides. Yes, there's a lot of missing events and timelines because I'm taking all of that part of our history, squeezing it down to just a couple of slides. But I want you to just kind of remember that running in the background of these other sort of environmental crisis events was Bell Laboratory and NASA in a joint effort in the 60s for satellites that would capitalize on fine-tuning an 1800s discovery of utilizing the sun's energy to create electricity. And this technology, this was running in the background and is part of what we're using as our solutions today. So I find that really interesting. So take you back into the 1960s. So huge fire that seemed to catapult our country to really looking at pollution and how we make materials. The 1969 was really this this river catching fire in 1969 catapulted kind of the formation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which officially was started in 1970. And up to this point, this same river in Ohio had caught fire at least a dozen other times. Some of the main components of the materials that were burning in this river was spills and just the leftover pollution from the manufacture of Standard Oil, Republic Steel, US Steel, Sherwin-Williams paints. All of those are providing the bulk construction materials that we use in architecture. So put a pin in that because California goes to work on energy, but meanwhile, all this other stuff that allows us to be architects and to build is still, these products are responsible for a lot of this other pollution that's going on. So in the 1970s, then following this was the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. And this wasn't the only river and the only hazardous toxic waste that was taking place in our country. Then in the later part of the 1970s, we also had an oil embargo, and it created what was known as the energy crisis. And this was kind of the first energy crisis kind of felt nationwide. And as a result of this kind of building towards this energy crisis and the EPA now having been formed, all of that pollution, California as a state also started to implement and create policy that would become the reason behind we have in California Energy Commission. So in 1974, the Warren-Alquist Act establishes our California Energy Commission. And then our California Energy Commission has been working ever since to create the Part 6 of our Title 24 building code that addresses the energy use in buildings. And then also tagging on to that, then we ended up creating a Part 11 to the Title 24 Energy Code that's also known as the California Green Code that addresses some other aspects of our buildings and their impact on the environment. So that's kind of the first, big bucket to say, okay, we have to address how much energy our buildings use. So that was implemented. Now that that was sort of addressed, then California is now looking at what's the implication? Did it work? Were we able to avoid building new power plants as a result of improving the efficiency of our construction of our buildings? And the answer was yes. So this graph here on the right gives an idea of why we were able to avoid the construction of 30 power plants. So California is the blue line. And what this is showing is how many kilowatt hours, all the energy is converted to kilowatt hours per person to give an idea of how much energy each person uses in our state. And after the energy code and dips for energy crisis, and then now coming out into the 1980s, and then heading out towards 2010 straight across, we see that the curve flattens down, so that even though the population in California has grown, even though our building stock has grown, our actual energy use per person has been held really flat. Whereas the rest of the country at this time that was not implementing these types of codes and policies, the energy use per person has been increasing and increasing significantly, almost double. So there's a couple key legislation and policies that came in California. So we had in 2004, by executive order, we had the Green Buildings Action Plan that was pulled in. And then in 2006, AB 32, we had the Global Warming Act solution. 2008, the California Long-Term Energy Efficiency Strategic Plan. We're going to hit on that a little bit. And then in 2012, the California Energy Commission has a report, and then they're saying, okay, take a look. This is the result of what happened, where they are able to now have enough data to show that they were able to hold the energy use per capita flat. Now, another piece of this puzzle, when we talk about this big picture of where California is going and avoiding building new power plants and how much energy do buildings use, it's really important to understand, well, what is the mix of energy that goes into producing our electricity? And if we're not, and sometimes we're burning natural gas or liquid propane at our site, but we're also using natural gas in power plants, peaker power plants, to provide energy throughout the 24 cycle and to provide that extra electricity when we don't have solar or wind or large hydro. So California has the black line at the bottom that's nearly petered out. It represents coal. And then we've got large hydro, which is the blue line, which dips down during times of drought and then peaks back up when we either are not having drought, or in our current situation as we're getting electricity from Canada and Oregon, Washington from their large hydro. And we've seen a steady increase of solar energy and wind energy. And then what we're noticing on our natural gas side is that it has been coming down, but it did peak up a little bit in the last few years towards the end of the graph here as our large hydro water goes down. And that this is going to cue up something that's called a duck curve. So just kind of put another pin in this and keep it in mind when Andy is talking about why wind power and solar power are important as part of the energy mix. So then we're seeing, okay, we can't always rely on large hydro. We're trying not to burn fossil fuels throughout the day, because what we find out is that we're going to start to introduce in this next big bucket, step C, we're going to introduce more and more renewable energy. And that is a great thing. So now the efficiency of our solar cells has come down, the cost, has gone up, and the cost of the solar cells has come down. And it's California Energy Commission was able to show that it was cost effective to introduce renewable energy into our buildings. So we have now a momentum for solar energy. So private homes and multifamily was requiring some form of PV in the prior energy code 2019, and now in our new 2022 code, we've got commercial projects and some industrial projects and hospitality that now also require PV. In the meantime, we continue building utility scale solar energy. Another big part of this mix is wind power. And wind is increasing capacity, and we're increasing construction of wind power. And it's definitely part of the Clean Energy Act of 2018, where wind power has been targeted to be an important part of this mix. And part of that reason is the wind is blowing a lot of times when the sun is not shining. So it adds some resiliency and stability to our energy grid. And there's a plan to have at least 20 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2045. And again, because we're focusing on the Tri-County region, Ventura, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo counties, I included this just to let you all know that off the coast of Cambria in California, there's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has designated an area where this wind power is going to be going. And it's going to produce up to the 2.9 gigawatts of clean energy. And some of these companies that won the bids for this say they can double that. So this is pretty interesting. A part of having grid stability is looking at the boundaries beyond California's grid. So the reason I mention this too is because as we're looking in that bucket of like, okay, how do we deal with our grid, our energy? Where is it coming from? We've got solar, we've got wind, but sometimes Arizona has a lot of wind power, and they're producing more wind power than they need at the moment, and they're able to export it to California when we need it, for example. And our part of this big grid now is connected with Canada, and we've got large hydro projects in Canada that and northern part of the US that can export their energy to us when we need it. But also California is having a huge production of solar energy during the peak of the day. And rather than just shed it off and not use it at all, we're able to export it to these other states so they can use it. And California is identified, and Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Canada, all they've all taken a look at this and said, okay, electrification is the path to decarbonization, and being able to share that energy back and forth is going to be key for grid stability. And there's a great, on the California Energy Commission website, there's this great called the California Clean Energy Almanac, which has got kind of an excerpt and little snapshots of their larger study for all this. And it's a great resource. If you go on there, you can read up more on each of these. Now, the cool thing about California right now, and this question does come up a lot, saying, okay, if I switch to a heat pump, for example, and I'm using electricity, is that really better than burning natural gas right at my house? And it used to be that creating the electricity created a bunch of pollution, and you had to burn natural gas to get that electricity. So why not just burn the natural gas at the house in the first place and not waste all that energy through the transmission lines? And that was true multiple years ago. But as California is able to get renewables and large hydro projects on board with the energy grid, we're now at this tipping point where we hit in 2020, 59% of our electric energy is coming from renewables, and it's a little bit higher now. So now we're at that tipping point where moving to electric, high efficiency electric heat pumps, for example, is reducing pollution in California as opposed to just burning the natural gas at your house. So that's why you're seeing a big movement towards electrification. And then part of that, beyond that building, is like, how do you support your buildings? So Andy's going to jump in here with this little bit of a sidebar and saying, okay, we're producing now a lot of electricity during the day from photovoltaics. What else do we plug in to our buildings that are now demanding electricity use?
Awesome, thank you. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you have questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat. We'll have time at the end as well, but if you have something burning, feel free to start to ask those questions. So we've Jennifer has been giving a great overview of where we are with the grid and the history and what direction we're going, and just want to take a moment, a little sidebar here to be to re-ground it in the role of architects, right? So we kind of know the building and the energy efficiency piece that we've been building on, now the renewable energy, but really we're also know that the carbon impacts are super embedded in transportation as well. So there's different ways that architects are going to be influenced that in the design of the buildings, but of course we're also being increasingly required to support electrification of our transportation. And each code cycle that ramps up as well. This is a photo that Jennifer took at Hearst Castle. And so they obviously have a big solar array and they're including charging. So that is in the direct purview of the architect. The new code cycle, 2022 code that took effect in January, increases the requirements for the design community to include charging stations for electric vehicles. In the prior code cycle, there was a electric EV ready or EV capable, so that we would be ready for infrastructure. And in this code cycle, we're now actually required to install charging stations. So we have another webinar all focused on Cal Green and that building code, but here's just a sneak peek to make sure it's on all of our radar, that if you do a new commercial project or even potentially a major renovation to a parking lot, if you've got 25 or more spaces, you have to be installing at least 2 electric vehicle charging stations, in addition to some EV capable, which is just kind of the conduit only in the space. And new to this cycle is the recognition that we're trying to electrify our transportation for material goods as well. So if you are working on a grocery store or a large retailer, a warehouse, you're going to have additional electric capacity and wiring for future EV charging stations for medium and heavy duty trucks. So it'll be level 2 required for the commercial parking spaces. Then on the residential side, the single family, if you want to pull the next slide, Jennifer. 1 and 2 family dwelling units, there's no change to that part of the code. You still need to be EV capable, which is the conduit, so that you're ready for future. And they used to have more emphasis on EV ready, where you'd have the wiring, and that still has some requirements, but maybe not quite as many, because they don't want a bunch of copper abandoned, an abandoned resource, as it were. So multifamily has new requirements. So if it's 20 dwelling units or fewer, you don't have to install the actual charging station. But if it's 20 or more dwelling units, there is a charging station requirement. And we're finding that people are doing it anyway, right? For commercial, they want to be able to attract employees. For residential, they want to be able to support transportation. So we have a couple of examples in here, and in terms of how those integrate. And then that brings us, yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, and just to remind folks, I mean, part of the reason too we snuck in this whole thing on the transportation is also because in many instances that, like your last point on your slide, is that now car charging is, you're going to see it now as a building load on the energy use. So as architects too, it's like, okay, yes, you have a certain amount of infrastructure. You think about how much energy your building's going to use with your appliances. Well, now you're going to be including folks' cars in that. And so as a direct result, we'll hit more on it in the presentation, the second part of the presentation. There's code updates on panel size, electric panel size as well for that.
All right, great. And Peggy is asking about what kind of EV. So trickle chargers, too slow. The middle ground is that level 2. That's kind of what we're used to seeing. There isn't a requirement right now for the high speed, like the Tesla type of chargers. So good question, although that may be coming. And so this just to, as Jennifer was starting to talk about in terms of the impacts to our buildings and our sites. And this is called the duck curve. I'll just spend a moment kind of walking you through it. This is a measure of net load. So there's this, all those system operators that know where the different power plants are across California and in our partner states. they're having to figure out, okay, how much energy do we need in any given moment to be able to meet the demand? And so that top gray line that says 2012, that's an actual net load over the course of a day in spring. And it's showing, you might need as much as 22,000 megawatts, and then maybe it drops to 20,000 or 18,000 megawatts, but there's kind of a band that the grid was able to support. Well, the next year and even more so after that, what we're seeing is that as renewable energy comes online, and specific to the buildings themselves, and in conjunction with our buildings being more efficient so that they're not requiring as much load. So what's that showing is that in the middle of the day, kind of that 12 to 3 peak time, is that we don't need very much energy from the grid. But as the sun is going down and everybody's going home and charging up their electric vehicles and all those things, we need a huge dramatic increase in our energy from the rest of the grid. And this is really impactful. That's why we talk about grid resilience and what are the impacts. And it's getting more and more impactful. So great news that we're using less energy in the middle of the day, that we need, our net demand has gone down, but we're really struggling to meet the offset on the other end. So we've got to figure out the energy storage solution is what that's talking about. And hand that back to Jennifer.
Right. And then so this next big bucket, kind of step D, is looking at our electric grid resiliency, the stability, and storage. And the whole idea was to get enough traction, get enough renewable energy on board so that it would be impactful. And so, like Andy said, the good news is, okay, that's working in California. We did it. And now we're at that next step. And I do hear a lot of folks have asked me, saying like, well, this is crazy. We've got all this solar energy during the day, but we're still having to burn these peaker power plants that run off natural gas at night. And then they can't really take them offline. They can't really shut them down. All they can do is disconnect them from the grid because they have to make room for solar, or they have to take something offline. And so, yes, there are really smart people who've been waiting. They've been like on the precipice. Yes, this is exactly what they knew would happen. And now we're at that point where a lot of storage systems, large scale storage systems, are going into play. And part of that that graphic that I showed you of the Western US, Canada, parts of Mexico, all that too, is to have a larger area of grid interconnectedness with different sources of electricity so it could stabilize the grid and use storage in meaningful ways so that we can not need to burn fossil fuels during the night to supplement that big demand for energy. So a couple different things are going on with battery storage. The large utility scale type of battery storage, and then we've got large commercial and industrial projects that are going in to just help with the those processes that are taking place in those commercial and industrial facilities. And then new to the code for 2022 energy code is that on the non-residential projects, battery storage and PVs are being required. So both, and it's part of addressing this grid stability and resiliency. And the batteries now, the battery technology, battery chemistry has come quite a bit of ways, and there's all all sizes and many more types of batteries. Give you just a little bit idea of what that looks like. There's been some great work and a really great project in the Netherlands that is using a combination of mechanical flywheels and lithium ion batteries, where they're doing a hybrid of both, and they're having good luck with that. So that is up and running, and they're hoping to kind of export that sort of technological solution to places. We've got in California, and there's a couple other places in our country that have it, but the California Helms plant under PG&E is a great example of just taking the water and pumping it during the day when you've got that energy, and pumping it up higher, and then at night releasing that water back through turbines to produce electricity at night. And then there's this great very interesting project that is being slated to be built out in Willow Rock. And this is a rendering of large scale storage that is planned for California to help with some of that grid stability. On a more local scale, so bring some of this back to our Tri-County region, out in Morro Bay, 22-acre site at the old power plant, where for the folks, I think most folks on the call are from this area, but you know, when you go out to Morro Bay, you see the stacks out there near the coast, near Morro Rock. And that same site now is being looked at, and it's proposed to have a BESS, so battery energy storage system, that would be able to add grid stability. And that site is very close to the within 15 to 20 miles of that proposed wind energy sites that I was showing you off the coast of Cambria. So these things would be work together. And Andy gave me a little update on this, and so I think some folks are a little concerned about having large scale battery storage in Morro Bay. And one of the concerns is maybe fire because of the lithium ions battery type, but there are more battery technologies out there. That's not the only type of battery system out there, but the idea that we would have battery storage near the wind power and add to grid stability is part of what California and the utility companies are needing to look at. Andy, do you have any kind of more update on this one to add?
No, I think it'll be, we got to watch that play out. It's still a big work in progress and in process, that it still is having its the CEQA environmental review. We are having a bit of a sidebar conversation here in the chat about the electric vehicles batteries as part of that grid stability as well, which I think it still has a lot of potential. And if we can get more vehicles charging during the day, like at workplaces, and then have it kind of the systems in place to be able to go back and use that car battery to charge your home during those peak 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. hours is really, I think that still has a lot of promise. Jennifer, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that briefly.
No, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And so, like a lot of us who are interested in technology, we try and experiment on ourselves. And so I've been just kind of as my own in the back of my mind, monitoring my own behaviors of how and when I use my electric vehicle, and how much I need to charge it, and when do I use it, and where do I go. And I find that on the days that I need to go into San Luis Obispo, that'd be kind of impractical, because I usually get here at the end of the day on a super low battery, and I'm like, well, great, I really want to charge up my car. And it's right at that time when everything's ramping up. I mean, okay, does that make sense? But then, like today, okay, I'm doing the class, I'm doing the hybrid work thing, and I'm here at my house. And okay, today's foggy, but yesterday it was completely sunny. I didn't go anywhere. It's like, yeah, I totally could have charged up my car right in the middle of the day if I had the solar. I could have totally used it, the battery later on. It all would have been fine. But I think
Yeah.
my own personal habits would be I need a system that's smart, that has like onboard electronics to just figure that out for me. And my next goal is to get uh, a PV system, or even just the battery store, well, both the battery storage system. Oh, in fact, let me just click on to the next slide, because actually it goes right into this, because we have got the NEM 2 and NEM 3 electric rates. And where I was going with this is, in my own case, it's like, okay, with the NEM 3 electric rate, if I do the PVs and the battery together, then it's cost effective. It's looking to have a 9-year kind of lock-in rate and a 9-year payback. That was the general thinking. But if you're not going to do the battery, then the PV system alone is not so cost effective. And those new rates went into effect on April 13th. So many of you may have seen the big rush, get your solar system in now, get your rates locked in now before the NEM 3 rate comes out. With the energy code, because of these things we're talking about, just 2022 energy code, the PV and battery, it's now, together, it's now required for the commercial occupancies. But for the residential side of it, it's called battery ready requirements. So you're supposed to put in the infrastructure and have panel large enough that you would easily be able to install a future battery. And then the PV system continues to be a requirement for the residential occupancies. And one thing new to the code, I think it is worth mentioning, is that if you really have a very small PV system that would have been required under the code, new construction only, by the way, new construction residential, if that PV system is smaller than 1.8 kilowatts DC, you don't have to put in the PV system. So that part's new. It's not cost effective under these new rates for those small systems. But the larger systems, and you do the battery under the NEM 3 rates, should be cost effective. And kind of tied in with that as a code update, just FYI, now a 225 amp panel with the future transfer switch for the battery is the new requirement on the residential. Andy, you want to add something about that? You have experience with PVs on your house.
I do, but I'm also kind of watching the clock and think, and there's some great conversations that
good.
I'm hoping we'd be able to save to the end. But at this point, probably better keep going.
Okay, good. Okay, great. All right, so we talked about energy efficiency, and then avoiding the building of power plants. We've got more renewable energy on our grid. Now we've introduced battery storage, and more of that will come into play, and making our grid more stable in general. Talked about the duck curve and what that really means in terms of when do we use our energy, and what can we do to make as much energy when the wind blows, when we have hydro, when the sun is shining, and then store it to that time of day that many people in California need the energy. And now, with that kind of address, so to speak, now this next big bucket, step E, is to look at the energy that it takes to create our building materials. But when we put energy into something, it's more than that. It also means that the energy production itself has an impact, but all the creation of all the materials have a pollution and a carbon emissions impact. So now we're going to look at the embodied carbon of our materials. And that is really the next kind of challenge for California, as they put it, is the decarbonization of the buildings. So one of the largest impacts, according to the California Resources Air Quality Control Board, so one of the biggest impacts for greenhouse gases is our transportation sector. And that includes the transportation of all our construction materials, all our building materials, and everything we consume in and around and throughout our buildings. And then the next biggest piece of it is that operational carbon, which is the everyday use of heating our buildings and heating our hot water and cooking in our buildings, which is still primarily a fossil fuel base. So those two things are the biggest. We've looked at energy efficiency in the buildings, but now this next step is to identify everything else. And one way we can look at that for the greenhouse gas emissions part of it, GHG, is to take a look at how much sort of pollution is associated with economic sectors. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this is one way to categorize the information. It's one way to deal with all the data that California and actually the country, the US, has been collecting on itself. However, I want to point out to all of us as architects that our buildings are a part of every one of these economic sectors, because our buildings depend on the transportation of people to get in and around our buildings. The buildings are automatically part of the commercial sector and the residential sector. It's also part of the electricity import sector, because we're importing electricity to run our buildings. Same thing with our in-state production. And our buildings are responsible for a huge part of the industrial sector, because the industrial sector is creating all the products and materials that we need in our buildings. So just kind of FYI, it's not like, oh, buildings only account for a tiny piece of the puzzle, so we're done. It's like, nah, we got to look at the big picture. So this great study that was commissioned by the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board started to take a look at all those overlapping sectors and tried to begin to categorize this in a way that many of us who work in the industry and are part of our community who care about this stuff can start to look at places to make a difference in part of California's overall goal to decarbonize. So it includes like vehicle freight and that electrification. It includes the building electrification. But it also is going to include something called F gases and the CO2 that's created and the other pollution created from cement manufacturing, which directly use the cement in our buildings. And the F gases are those things that are the refrigerants that go into our mechanical heating and cooling systems. So all these things have been broken out. This is a great study. I like the way they divided this up and called it the pillars of decarbonization. And then another study started to look at this and say, okay, if we have greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, we've got our energy and our non-combustion type of energy use. We need to look at how do we remove carbon and other pollutions? How do we capture it? How do we store that? And it can be stored like within the agriculture, it can be stored within trees. But beyond that, how do we sequester it? And there's some technology out there called natural and working lands, CO2 sinks, where there's certain type of soils that literally help latch on to CO2 and pull it into the soil, and then it can be turned and be put back into the soil. And so there's some work in some countries and studies going on, like how much of this kind of agricultural land do we still need as working lands that can actually hold on to carbon and pull it out of the air. And so it's going to have to be all of these things together to get to carbon neutrality. So now, operational carbon, embodied carbon, kind of what's the difference? These just as this reminder, because really we're talking now, we're moving beyond energy and into talking about carbon. So the operational carbon would be part of the carbon emission during that operation of a building. In heating, cooling, heating your hot water, moving your water to get to your building, for example. And then the embodied carbon would be the amount of carbon that's emitted during making the building, which would include the extraction of the raw materials and the manufacture and refinement of that materials, which includes the energy going into that, the transportation. So again, we get back to like our vehicles and how are we moving these, and the deconstruction and disposal of the materials at the end of life. So kind of all of that goes into this embodied carbon part of the picture. And all of the energy, it's when you include all those things for our buildings, it's a huge amount, and it's almost 3/4 of our kind of energy pie. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Andy, who's going to hit on a few of kind of these, the Buy Clean California Act, for example, and a couple other things to sort of tie all this kind of back together, just to wrap up this where we started, just looking at energy that the buildings were used, kind of bigger picture, how our buildings are part of our whole energy system and the California energy grid. And then moving beyond that and looking at the carbon emissions and energy that it goes into creating our buildings and all our materials in the first place. Okay.
Great. So the Buy Clean California Act is it was passed in 2017, and it's been kind of rolling into implementations just a couple of years, just in the last year or two. And so the bills intended to address just what Jennifer is talking about, the greenhouse gas emissions for materials. But they had to start somewhere, and so they just kind of picked the materials that they felt like they could reliably have a hard metric for. So it's just reinforcing steel, so rebar and concrete, black glass, mineral wool board insulation, and structural steel, both plates and shapes. And that's kind of it right now. So, but they did come out with actual standards. And they set up a process for following an industry document called an Environmental Product Declaration, EPDs. We'll be talking a lot more about that. But super interesting in that at the federal level, they're looking at similar standards and maybe building on what California has already done to include some of the other high impact materials, like concrete is notably not on here, or all insulation, so you're not just focusing on the one. So that's the Buy Clean California Act. And then this is kind of, again, thinking about that, where is embodied carbon that we've been talking about. And so if you see kind of that in these stages, in these stages here, is that there's kind of that product category, and within each one there's these modules. So extracting raw material, transporting it, manufacturing. That's kind of modules A1, A2, A3. Construction has its own impacts. Maintenance and use has its own impact. And so each of those categories, you'll see only B6 and B7 is operational, right? So we spent so much time like talking about operational energy, and we're just now trying to get our hands and heads around all of the materials itself. And then there's this whole other one, end of life. What do we do with that? Do we recycle it? So that vocabulary of cradle to cradle, like a material, there is no waste in nature, in those types of conversations. So there's a lot to this. And again, we'll talk about the embodied carbon more in module 4. So on the in terms of these environmental product declarations, though, just so you're starting to kind of keep an eye out for these forms, you'll see that the in that gray box there is that same alignment. It's so pretty and color coded on the other slide, but here but it's the same language, A1, A2, A3, and they're starting to like, what can you capture? And then there's that whole section in the middle. It's just, we don't really have great ways to talk about the numbers in a general level. So for this particular product, they said, oh, you know, that's not part of our calculation. But then as you zoom in and we think about global warming potential, it's carbon, CO2, but it's also methane, and there's nitrous oxide and all these other things. But in order to get our heads around all of those different materials with a global warming potential, we use the metric of CO2 equivalent. And so that first line item there, global warming potential, is measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And then that kind of scientific notation, which I don't quite understand how that is helpful in our being able to apply this to real world. So it's like, okay, that one's, you know, 3,300, you know, wherever it is that we're going. So those are the numbers that we're going to be looking out for in terms of looking at carbon, but it includes carbon equivalent in terms of that, because like methane is so much more impactful than CO2, for example.
Right. And then those metrics are really, it's really only helpful, I think, when we reach the point where a lot of these materials are in the LCA software, life cycle assessment software, because those can all be added together once you tell the computer program how much material you're using, you know, based on your floor plans, elevations, then it can take those numbers and metrics and make a calculation.
And being facetious, they need to be able to track those numbers when they're very, very small and very, very big. So and then just to kind of wrap up in terms of the look ahead to Cal Green, which is the California Green Building Standards, and this draft language, super interesting that Cal Green is moving towards a intervening code cycle amendment to the Cal Green in order to include mandatory requirements for CO2 reduction. So it's focused on concrete. There's also a life cycle assessment kind of opportunity. But whereas the Build Clean California Act are requirements for public projects that are state funded, this one is going to apply to everybody. And so it's maybe 50,000 square foot building might trigger it, or 100,000. They're still kind of figuring out how to phase it in. So we'll find out in July, August what the actual language will be, and it'll take effect in July of 2024. So we'll keep an eye out for that one, but we're going to be checking. It's here. It's right on our doorstep that will be required to be tracking embodied carbon. And with that, we're going to wrap up and jump into questions and discussion. Before we stop sharing, though, and open it up more, maybe if we could just run through the couple of closing slides. I'll start here and then turn it over to Itzel. But I do want to while I have a captive audience, remind folks about the 3C Ren has an energy code coach service, totally free. It's for designers, buildings, building officials, plans examiners, inspectors, all those folks. You can send in your question about the energy code or Cal Green, and somebody will get back to you within 24 hours and help navigate that system. So otherwise, Itzel, if you want to talk through anything else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy and Jennifer. Just a little bit, few remarks. I'm dropping my email off for you. If you have any questions about AI continuing units, reach out. If you provided me your license number, I'll go ahead and start inputting that, and you should get a notification about that. But any other questions, feel free to reach out. You should see some slides, a recording, and a survey coming into you in your inbox. So on the lookout for that. And just a reminder of the dates for the courses coming up. So yeah, I'll make sure to drop our calendar. There's also a lot of different trainings in there that are interesting. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll hand it back to Andy and Jennifer for questions.
Great. So I think we can go ahead and stop sharing. And there was a kind of a logistics questions about logging the hours for licensure. And basically, just like the access compliance, it's a bit of the honor system. So you have to have some kind of documentation available that you've done the units in case you are audited, but otherwise you're kind of checking a box on there. So you still have to do your 5 units of access compliance and then the 5 units of zero net carbon design. At the end of the whole series, we'll send out certificates for so that if you did all 5, then you just get 1 certificate. If you only did 3, you'll get that. But if you need something sooner, just let Itzel know. All right. And so I think, I mean, there's been some good conversations about the kind of the grid stability and large PVs and costs and incentives. Happy, you know, folks, anybody wants to raise their hand and unmute and ask a question directly or make a comment, you know, honestly. And then if you need to duck out, that's kind of your hour, you've achieved your unit, but we're happy to stay on, and we could chat about this all day, but we'll at least stay on for a little bit longer here.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and just, if someone wants to, or Andy, was there any questions in the chat?
I mean, I think it was more commentary. The one that I would say, there was one talking about just talking about the cost of solar production and storage, and you know, are there incentives and kind of how to make that work. I know that 3C Ren has some incentives for residential right now, multifamily, I think, as well. And then depending if you're part of a community choice aggregator, like Central Coast Clean Energy is one, Santa Barbara has its own, the Bay Area has a few. So those programs have some rebates. I'm actually, I think another one, Jennifer, I wanted to mention was the, when we were talking about batteries, about thermal storage, just that, you know, like a heat pump water heater can be smart so that it charges, it heats up the water, superheats it during the middle of the day as an opportunity, and then it just kind of rides out the night for hot water and can be used for heating your home if that's a system that folks are used. So I think those are kind of a couple things we could, I don't know if you have other kind of incentive things you want to bring up.
If you're looking at appliances for your home, those kind of incentives, log on to the website that is set up for PG&E and then Southern California Edison. You could get to it through your utility company if your electricity is coming from either of those, because they've got access to which products have the rebates and the amount based on their energy efficiency. And I
Hey,
said, oh, I did see one question pop up. Can we get a copy of the slides? I don't know if that got sent out. And yes, the answer is yes, you will be getting a copy. Is that
and we'll also send out a link to the, it'll send out a link to the recording in that same one. So you get the slides, the recording. I think you have to attend them, you know, live in order to get the continuing education credits though. Because otherwise we don't have any way to know who's on the call.
I'm just
Yeah,
now
I mean,
getting a chance to look at some of the comments. I haven't been able to read them all. It looks like there's a lively chat going on. That's cool.
yeah, I think I love the folks that you know, trying for the all electric approach and what does that mean for the storage. I love the vehicle opportunity. There was a really neat program I saw where school buses were being procured by a school district in a community so that they're basically traveling batteries. So electric school buses that ran the regular routine, but if there was an emergency, that the bus would be routed to a particular building, like a shelter, and it would power up the building. Because, you know, I mean, those are big batteries for a whole school bus. So I thought that was just a really great program for both resilience and clean transportation.
Right. And as an architect, if you have clients that even hint at being interested in anything like that, you know, small scale or large scale, then you'll want to work closely with the electrical engineer and set up the wiring and set up all your panels and everything so that you can isolate certain loads so that you're able to connect to a battery system or have some battery on there so that you can be very specific on what things you would be able to power up. And so part of the battery sizing too, under the new 2022 code for those non-residential occupancies, is you look at your battery capacity, but also the battery like peak load, what it's able to handle. And so that's, the CEC says, okay, here's the requirement, but to be really useful and practical with that too is you'll want to be strategic in what you're firing up, so to speak, because it'll determine how many hours you will have on that battery system for what its connected load is.
That's a requirement right now, right? That you have to be pre-wired to have those backups, your refrigerator.
For the residential, on your residence for the battery ready, there's 3 things you have to have powered, but 4 circuits. So you get to choose what this 4th one is. But one of them, like Andy was saying, is your refrigerator, and you'd have to have your light, an emergency light, and you would have a receptacle outlet in a bedroom someplace, and presumably you could plug in something or at least recharge your phone, and then you have a 4th circuit you could set up. But 4 circuits kind of pulled off from your panel that would be part of that battery backup. And on the non-res, like on one of the projects we're working on, it's been a big discussion with the ownership on how big of a battery system do they want based on what do they want to be able to have running during power outages.
Great. There's still some good conversation if anybody in the chat, if anybody wants to unmute and chime in on some of the conversations about the battery storage and the sizing. I will say we're working on a project in which that's pretty big in Santa Barbara campus approach. And they are looking at a kind of a power purchase agreement that includes batteries. And one of the factors was how many cars are you going to be able to charge, and could that be a publicly cost one? Is it Taya? You want to unmute and make a comment?
Yeah, one of the things I have a question about the role of architects in designing more at the small community level, because I think the future of electrification is microgrids and resiliency of a small community with its own microgrid, et cetera. So what would you like to comment on how you think architects can get more involved in project level design rather than just this building or that building in isolation?
Yes, a great question, a great comment. Run for office. I think that there is it does go out to what is the role of architects in terms of, I think that we have a much bigger potential to be leaders in this realm, is that we have a sense of what that looks like. And so to be able to, if we just kind of relinquish that role to, I mean, not that engineers can't do that and can't have that kind of creativity, but I think that we need to bring into the conversation the equity component of resiliency, like how are we serving our whole communities. I think being smart about like what are the opportunities in microgrids in particular, so that if it's, like a fire station maybe has a couple of buildings that needs that wants that microgrid component, but how can we, if we're, if we have clients and we're working at that scale, how can we open it up to neighboring communities, or connecting small pods of microgrids, and then be able to think about a larger grid that envelops that in the long run. And those are some of my thoughts. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. At this point, it's more discussion than Q&A necessarily.
Yeah, and then I saw something pop up in the chat really quick that someone had commented about battery chemistry and looking at cobalt-free, battery chemistry. And there's truth. There's we'll hit a little bit on it in the next session, but there's absolutely a lot to kind of keep your eye on in terms of battery chemistry and where those minerals are coming from, because there are certain battery chemistries that are salt-based that don't have cobalt in them, some that are utilizing a lot more iron, and other minerals that are readily available and easily mined. So yes, it's like a whole nother specialty. But yes, as architects who care about these things too, I think just keep your eye on what's happening with the batteries and the battery chemistries. I guess that's a short way of saying yes. I saw your comment. It's near and dear to my heart also, and now we need like another couple hours.
All right. And then Jennifer, I don't know if you saw this one from Nancy about, this is because this might be part of your personal experience, a 220 outlet for new induction cooktop, took out the gas stove, but then had to get a new 220 line into her kitchen. I know I just did the stand-in heat pump water heater, and I'm still trying to work within my 100 amp panel because I'm terrified of having to upgrade the service and what for us it's PG&E, what those implications are. So if you can if you can work within your current amps, if you have enough circuits and sub panels, but if you know, in this case, it sounds like they need an all new 220 service just to get to the house. Not necessarily a whole lot we can do on that one, but there are upgrades through 3C REN and others for panel upgrades in the electrification.
Yes, and then if you just need to run a new outlet to your kitchen specifically for that induction stove, yeah, there's unfortunately with remodels that it's pretty common, and that's like take the price of everything else you were doing and just add another $1,000 to it to have the electrician come out and run it. And no, they don't know of any incentives right now that would help take care of that. I know I have learned from my own experience that if you're doing remodel work and you have not procured photovoltaics or battery system yet, and you cannot afford to do that upfront, then working with a company like Sunrun, and there's a handful of others that essentially you're leasing the electricity, you know, the panels from them and locking in a certain rate. I know that they're rolling in the panel upgrades to their whole cost, because a lot of times they have to upgrade the whole panel and run some new lines. So that could play in for you.
Right, which
Just
goes back
depends.
to that question about the microgrids and you know, having everybody have their own little service panel, but you know, how do we look at it for resilience within a community?
Yeah. Hawaii, I don't know if the person who was commenting on that already knew about it, but if not, then Hawaii is a really great place to start looking into some of their solutions, because they were able to do that with bringing in, upgrading the service in certain locations and batteries, certain locations, and creating the microgrids in certain neighborhoods. And they were experimenting with that. Seemed like it was going like pretty good way to do it.
Very cool. All right, I think we're at the end of our time. Super fun conversation, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone join us at the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Cecil. Bye.